The massive station hung in space like a jewel against the darkness, its crystalline spires catching the light of 3 distant suns and throwing rainbow patterns across the void around. The Star Prime and Ambassador Marcus Chun stood at the viewing port of his shuttle, watching the structure grow larger as they approached, and he had seen many wonders in his 15 years as a diplomat. But the Galactic Council station never failed to impress him with its architecture that seemed to defy the laws of physics. He had learned as a child back on Earth. The shuttle docked with a soft thud that Marcus barely felt through the deck plating, and he gathered his papers, straightened his formal robes, and took a deep breath before the airlock opened, and the atmosphere that rushed in was different from what humans preferred, but he had trained his body to handle it without showing discomfort, and that was part of his job. After all, 2 Velthani escorts waited for him in the corridor, and their elegant forms moved with a grace that always reminded Marcus of dancers, and their skins shimmered with colors that shifted from blue to violet as they regarded him with what he had learned to recognize as barely concealed disdain. "Ambassador Chun," the taller one said, his voice musical but cold, "and the council awaits your presentation." Marcus nodded politely and followed them through corridors that seemed designed to make visitors feel small, and the ceiling soared high above, decorated with the symbols of 100 different species, and humanity's mark was there too, but it was tucked away in a corner and much smaller than the others, and Marcus had stopped letting such things bother him years ago. The council chamber was a vast, circular room with seating arranged in tiers that rose toward a domed ceiling, and representatives from dozens of species filled the seats, and their various forms created a tapestry of shapes and colors that would have seemed impossible to someone from Earth's past. And Marcus walked to the center platform, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence that fell as he approached. Counselor Vrethuk of the Krikstar dominated the highest tier, and his insectoid form was massive and covered in chitinous plates that gleamed like polished obsidian, and his compound eyes tracked Marcus's movement with the precision of a predator watching prey. And beside him sat the Zan representative, Sarath, whose crystalline body refracted light in patterns that Marcus had learned indicated thoughtfulness. "Ambassador Chun of Earth." Vrethuk's voice buzzed and clicked through the translation matrix. "And you have requested this session to discuss trade route expansions, and the council has granted you this time to present your petition." Marcus bowed slightly and activated the holographic display that showed the contested region of space humanity wished to access and honored council members. He began, and his voice steady and clear, "And humanity requests permission to establish trade routes through the Keldaris corridor, and this region has been largely unused for the past century, and our projections show that opening these routes would benefit not only Earth, but also the Velthani trade networks and the gen mineral operations in the neighboring systems." A ripple of what Marcus recognized as amusement passed through the chamber, and several council members exchanged glances. "That needed no translation. The human speaks of benefit to us," one of the Velthani counselors said, and his tone dripping with mockery, and as if a species that has barely left its own solar system could offer anything of value to civilizations that spanned the galaxy before your ancestors learned to make fire. Marcus kept his expression neutral, and he had heard worse, and, "With respect, counselor," he replied, "and humanity may be young by galactic standards, but our innovations in renewable energy and our mathematical models for hyperspace navigation have already been adopted by 17 council species, and we believe this mutual exchange of knowledge and resources serves everyone's interests." Vrethuk leaned forward, and his mandibles clicking in a pattern that Marcus knew indicated displeasure. "And you speak of mutual exchange," the Krikstar said, "and yet you ask to cross space that your kind has no claim to, and you ask us to grant you passage through regions that we have protected and maintained while your world was still in its primitive state." The tension in the chamber grew thicker, and Marcus could feel the weight of hostile attention pressing down on him from all sides. And this was not going as he had hoped, but he had prepared for resistance. The Council's own charter speaks of cooperation between species, Marcus said, and he kept his voice respectful but firm, and it speaks of the right of all sentient beings to travel to stars and seek peaceful trade, and humanity has followed every protocol and met every requirement for this request, and we are not asking for special treatment, but for the same rights granted to other council members. A Velthani counselor stood, and her robes flowing around her like water. And you dare lecture us on our own charter? She demanded, and your species was granted council membership as a courtesy and a gesture of goodwill. And you were meant to listen and learn, and instead, you make demands as if you were our equals. Marcus felt something stirred deep in his chest, and something old and dangerous that he pushed down with practiced discipline. And we are your equals under council law, he said quietly, or has that law changed? The chamber erupted in angry voices and clicking and humming in a dozen different languages, and the translation matrix struggled to keep up with the overlapping conversations, and Marcus stood his ground and his hands clasped behind his back, and his breathing slow and contra-led breath raised one massive claw, and the chamber fell silent, and a human forgets his place. The Crickstar said, and perhaps this is what comes from granting membership too, freely to species that have not earned it through strength or wisdom, but merely through the accident of achieving space travel. We earned our place, Marcus replied, and the words coming out harder than he intended. And we met every requirement and passed every test. And if the council regrets that decision, then perhaps the council should examine why its requirements were set as they were. The silence that followed was different and colder and more dangerous, and Marcus realized he might have pushed too far, but he could not take the words. Back Nazareth, the Zean counselor, spoke for the first time, and her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. And perhaps, she said, and we should take a recess and allow tempers to cool, and we can reconvene in 2 cycles to continue this discussion with clearer minds. Vrethik looked as if he wanted to object, but several other counselors nodded in agreement, and very well. The Crickstar said finally, an ambassador, Chen, you will wait in the diplomatic quarters while the council deliberates, and we will summon you when we are ready to continue. Marcus bowed again and deeper this time, and thank you, counselor, he said, and turned to leave. As he walked back across the chamber floor, he could feel their eyes on him and hear the whispers that started as soon as he passed, and he knew they were talking about the arrogant human who dared to speak to his betters. As if he had any real power, 2 different Velthani guards met him at the entrance, and, "This way, ambassador," one said, and they led him through a different corridor and away from the main diplomatic wing and toward a more isolated section of the station. Marcus followed without complaint, and he was tired, and the effort of maintaining his calm demeanor had drained him more than he wanted to admit, and all he wanted was a quiet room where he could rest and prepare for the next round of negotiations. The guards stopped at a heavy door. "And your quarters, ambassador," one said, "and you will remain here until summoned." Marcus nodded and entered the room and heard the door seal behind him with a sound that seemed far too final for comfort, and the chamber was comfortable enough with furnishings designed to accommodate various species and a viewing port that showed the stars beyond. He removed his formal robes and sat down and let himself relax for the first time in hours, and his shoulders slumping and his head falling back against the chair, and he closed his eyes and tried not to think about how badly the session had gone outside the door and in corridors he could not see, and members of the council were having very different conversations than the ones they had in the chamber, and some of those conversations involved the arrogant human ambassador who needed to be taught a lesson about his place in the galactic order. Marcus did not hear these conversations, and he did not know that certain counselors had made a decision that would change everything. And he simply sat in his quarters and waited in believing that diplomacy would prevail as it always had, before he had no way of knowing that his faith in civilized discourse was about to be shattered. Marcus had been sitting in the diplomatic quarters for nearly 3 hours when he heard the door mechanism engage, and he stood and straightened his tunic and prepared to greet whoever had come to escort him back to the council chamber, and instead of the single aide he expected, and 5 figures entered the room. 3 were Crickstar and their massive insectoid forms, filling the doorway and their chitinous armor gleaming under the chamber's lights, and 2 were Velthani, and moving with that characteristic grace that seemed so at odds with what Marcus suddenly sensed was happening, and the door sealed behind them with a finality that made his stomach tighten. "Counselors," Marcus said, and keeping his voice level, "and I was not informed that we would be meeting here, and shall I prepare my presentation materials?" The largest Crickstar moved forward, and his mandibles clicking in a pattern that Marcus's training told him indicated aggression, and "There will be no more presentations, human," the alien said, and his voice a harsh buzz without the smoothing effect of the translation matrix, and "There will only be a lesson." Marcus took a step back, and his mind racing through protocols and diplomatic procedures, and "I don't understand," he said, and though he understood perfectly, and "If there is a concern with my conduct, I request that we address it through proper channels, and I have the right to contact the Earth Embassy, and you have no rights here," one of the Velthani interrupted, and her voice sharp and cold, "and you are in a secure diplomatic wing, and the security feeds have been disabled, and no one knows we are here, and no one will know what happens next." The truth of the situation crashed over Marcus like ice water, and these were not here to talk, and they were here to hurt him and maybe worse, and this was not supposed to happen, and not on a council station, and not in the heart of civilized space. "Please," Marcus said, and raising his hands in a placating gesture, "and whatever grievance you have, and we can resolve this peacefully, and I am a representative of Earth, and an attack on me is an attack on my entire species, and the consequences." The Crickstar laughed in a chittering sound that made Marcus's skin crawl. "And consequences?" The alien said, "And your species has no power here, human, and you are weak and soft, and you talk and talk, but you have no strength to back your words, and today you will learn what happens to those who forget their place." The first blow came fast, and a Velthani's clawed hand striking Marcus across the face and sending him stumbling backward, and pain exploded across his cheek, and he tasted blood in his mouth. And his training screamed at him to fight back, but he could not, and not yet, and not unless there was no other choice. "Stop," Marcus said, and his voice strained, "and you are making a terrible mistake, and please stop this now." Another blow, and this time from a Crickstar, and the alien's armored fist catching Marcus in the ribs, and he felt something crack, and the pain was immediate and sharp, and he doubled over and gasping for air, and his body wanted to respond and wanted to defend itself, but he forced it down and forced himself to remain passive. "Look at him," one of the Velthani said, and mockery dripping from her voice, and "This is what Earth sends to negotiate with us, and a creature that cannot even defend itself. And no wonder they beg for trade routes instead of taking them." They circled him now, and predators toying with prey, and Marcus straightened despite the pain, and his vision blurring slightly from the blow to his head. "And I am asking you one more time," he said, and each word carefully controlled, "and please stop this, and you do not understand what you are doing." "We understand perfectly," the lead Crickstar said, and struck Marcus again, and this time in the stomach, and Marcus collapsed to his knees, and fighting to breathe and fighting harder to maintain control, and something inside him was waking up, and something ancient and powerful, and he could feel it stirring like a beast that had been sleeping too long. The attacks continued, and blows raining down on him from multiple directions, and they tore at his diplomatic robes and mocking him and searching for the warrior that humans claimed to be in their histories, and all they found was blood and bruises and a man who refused to fight back. Marcus's mind was splitting, and part of him was here in this room and taking the beating and maintaining the facade that humanity had worked so hard to create, and the other part was sinking deeper and deeper into something primal, and something that humanity had spent generations learning to suppress. "Please," he said again, and the word coming out is barely a whisper, "and you do not know what we are, and you do not know what you are waking." One of the Krigstar grabbed Marcus by the throat and lifted him off the ground with terrifying ease. "And what you are?" the alien said, and bringing Marcus close to his compound eyes, "and you are nothing human, and you are soft meat and weak bones, and you are a species that stumbled into the stars by accident, and you have no place among the great civilizations." Marcus's vision was darkening, and not from lack of air, but from something else, and the control he had maintained for so long was slipping, and he could feel his body beginning to change and beginning to remember what it was designed to do and what evolution had created it for. "Last warning," Marcus managed to say, and his voice changing and deepening and taking on harmonics that should not have been possible for a human throat. "And stop now and walk away, and I will forgive this, and we can find another path." The Volthani laughed and listened to it threaten us. She said, "And what will you do, human? And file a complaint and write a strongly worded letter, and your words mean nothing." The Krigstar's grip tightened, and "We are going to break you," the alien said, and when we are done and when you crawl back to your little embassy, and you will tell your people that this is what happens when they pretend to be more than they are." Something inside Marcus snapped, and not his will but his control, and the carefully maintained locks that kept his true nature contained began to fail, and he had tried to warn them and had given them every chance, and now it was too late. His pupils dilated, and not the normal widening of human eyes, but something far more dramatic, and the iris expanding until the black nearly swallowed the color, and his heart rate, which had been elevated from the beating, suddenly spiked to nearly twice the normal human rhythm, and adrenaline flooded his system, but not in the amounts a normal human would produce. The Krigstar noticed the change in his compound eyes, registering something wrong, and "What?" the alien started to say. Marcus's hand shot up, and faster than any human should have been able to move, and grabbed the Krigstar's arm, and his fingers finding gaps in the chitinous armor with unerring precision, and his grip was suddenly strong enough to make the massive alien's exoskeleton creak. "I told you," Marcus said, and his voice was wrong now, and layered with growling undertones that came from deeper in his chest than his vocal cords. "And I told you to stop." The other aliens froze in watching as their companion tried to pull away from Marcus, and failed, and the human's grip was like a vice, and his fingers digging into the armor and starting to crack at Marcus's body was changing now, and not dramatically, and not like the shapeshifters in human fiction, but his muscles were becoming denser, and his bones were reinforcing themselves, and his entire structure was shifting from the carefully maintained diplomatic form to something evolution had designed for a very different purpose. His skin was flushing red, and not from embarrassment, but from increased blood flow, and his metabolism ramping up to levels that would have killed most species, and his eyes were tracking all 5 aliens simultaneously and processing their positions and movements and potential threats with predatory precision. "What are you?" the Krigstar whispered in fear, entering his voice for the first time. Marcus's diplomatic robes were tearing, and not designed to accommodate the slight but significant changes in his musculature and underneath the cloth. His body was scarred, and he had hidden those scars under makeup and careful clothing, but now they were visible, and marks from a lifetime of training that most aliens would never understand. "I am human," Marcus said, and his voice still wrong and still layered with that disturbing growl. But you do not know what that means, and you think you do, but you have only seen what we choose to show you. He released the Crickstar and pushed the alien backward with enough force to send the massive creature stumbling and the other aliens back toward the door, and their aggression replaced by uncertainty. We evolved on a death world, Marcus said, and he was standing now, and his posture changed, and no longer the careful diplomatic stance, but something lower and more balanced and ready to move in any direction, and a planet where the gravity is stronger than most of you can tolerate, and where the oxygen levels would be toxic to half the species in this council, and where everything evolved to kill everything else. One of the Velthani tried to run, and her grace making her fast, but Marcus was faster, and impossibly faster, and his hand caught her by the arm, and he did not hurt her, but he stopped her movement completely, and effortlessly. We are persistence predators, Marcus continued, and his breathing steady, despite everything and despite the beating and despite the changes, and do you know what that means? The council chamber had never been so full, and representatives from every member species crowded into the tiers, and those who could not fit watched from remote feeds, and the air hummed with a dozen different atmospheric preferences as life support. Systems worked overtime to accommodate the unprecedented gathering, and at the center of it all stood Marcus Chen, and his diplomatic robes repaired, and his face healed, and his body returned to its carefully maintained human form. The holographic display behind him showed footage that had somehow leaked from the security system, and footage that was supposed to have been disabled, but that some automated backup had captured anyway, and the entire galaxy was watching as Ambassador Marcus Chen transformed from a beaten diplomat into something that made species with warrior traditions reconsider their understanding of strength. Counselor Rethek sat in his usual position, but his posture was different, and his mandibles were still, and his compound eyes tracked Marcus with new respect, mixed with fear, and beside him, Sarath's crystalline form refracted light in patterns that indicated deep contemplation. The council is assembled, Rethek said, and his voice lacking its usual arrogance, and we are here to address the assault on Ambassador Chen, and to discuss the implications of what has been revealed about humanity. A murmur ran through the chamber, and thousands of voices in hundreds of languages, creating a wall of sound that the translation matrix struggled to process, and Marcus stood quietly and waiting, and his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that looked relaxed, but that he knew could transition to defensive readiness in a fraction of a second. Before we proceed, a Velthani counselor stood, and her voice sharp, and we must address the authenticity of the footage. And how do we know this? Transformation is real, and not some human trick or technology designed to intimidate us. Marcus had been expecting this, and he turned to face the counselor. And would you like a demonstration? He asked quietly. The chamber went silent, and the counselor's skin shifted through several colors, indicating emotional distress, and that will not be necessary, she said, and sitting down quickly. Shareth stood, and her voice like crystal bells in the sudden quiet. And I was there, she said, and I witnessed the transformation, and I can attest to its authenticity, but more importantly, and we have consulted with xenobiologists from a dozen species, and all of whom have examined the footage, and all of whom have confirmed that what we are seeing is biologically consistent with human evolution on high-gravity death world. She activated a secondary display and showing data that made several counselors lean forward, and Earth's gravity is 1.3 times galactic standard, Sarath said, and its oxygen content is 21%, and a level that would cause toxicity in most of our species within ours, and its temperature variations are extreme, and its predator-to-prey ratio during humanity's evolution was among the highest ever recorded. The display shifted to show human skeletal structure and musculature, and then showed those same systems under stress, and Humans possess a secondary physiological state, Sareth continued, and one that activates under extreme duress, and this state involves increased bone density through rapid mineral deposition and muscle compression that increases strength by a factor of 2 to 3, and metabolic acceleration. That allows for healing rates that exceed most galactic species by an order of magnitude. A Krigstar military commander stood, and his voice booming across the chamber, and, "If this is true," he said, "and if every human possesses this capability, and then why have we never seen it before? And in all our interactions, and in all our conflicts, and humans have never demonstrated this." Marcus spoke before Sareth could respond, and because we chose not to, he said, and because we decided that if we wanted to be part of the galactic community, and we needed to be the kind of species that the community could accept, and that meant suppressing what we are. He walked to the center of the platform, and his movements deliberately slow and carefully controlled, and the diplomatic corps is not just about negotiations and trade agreements. He said, "It is about maintaining the facade that makes you comfortable, and every human diplomat undergoes 10 years of training and learning to suppress instincts that are millions of years old, and learning to move carefully and to speak softly and to make ourselves smaller and weaker and less threatening." Another display activated and showing images of human children, and we start the training young. Marcus said, and every human child learns control and learns to be gentle despite the strength in their small hands, and learns to moderate their endurance despite bodies that want to run for hours, and by the time we reach adulthood and the suppression is so automatic we barely think about it. A counselor from a species Marcus did not recognize spoke, and their voice translated with a mechanical flatness, and "Why would you do this? And why would you handicap yourselves and make yourselves vulnerable?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, and choosing his words carefully, and because we remembered our history, he said, "And on Earth, and before we reached the stars, and we spent thousands of years fighting each other, and we built weapons that could destroy continents, and we nearly made ourselves extinct several times, and we were strong, and we were capable, and we almost destroyed ourselves because of it." The chamber was absolutely silent now, and every being present hanging on his words. "And when we finally achieved peace on Earth," Marcus continued, "and when we finally learned to work together instead of against each other, and it was because we learned that strength without restraint leads only to destruction, and we learned that being capable of violence is not the same as being required to commit it." He looked around the chamber and meeting eyes with as many counselors as he could, and "When we met you," he said, "and when we discovered we were not alone in the universe, and we saw species that were elegant and graceful and built on cooperation rather than competition, and we saw civilizations that had achieved wonders without the violence that marked our past, and we wanted to be part of that." Vrethik leaned forward, and his voice less hostile than before, but still skeptical. "And so you hid what you are," he said, "and you lied to the council. We chose what to show you." Marcus corrected, "And just as you choose what to show us, and the Krigstar are warriors, but I have seen your poetry and your art, and the Velthani are traitors, but I have seen your war memorials, and every species shows the face they want others to see, and we simply chose to show you the face we wanted to become, rather than the face we were born with." A Zun counselor who had been silent until now spoke, in their voice like grinding stone, "And but you failed," they said, "and the assault on you triggered your true nature, and your control broke." Marcus nodded, and "Yes," he said, "and that is the danger, and the more we are pushed, and the more we are threatened, and the harder it becomes to maintain. The suppression and what happened to me could happen to any human who faces violence or extreme stress." The implications rippled through the chamber. And if one human under stress could transform, then what about populations, and what about colonies? And what about crews of military ships? How many humans are there now? Someone asked from the upper tiers. 42 billion. Marcus said, and across 300 colony worlds and 10,000 ships, and all of them trained in suppression, and all of them capable of what you saw in that footage. The number hit the council like a physical force, and 42 billion. Beings, and all carrying within them the potential for transformation, and all choosing every day not to use it. This changes everything. A counselor said, and we cannot have a species this dangerous as council members, and they must be quarantined and contained. And contained? Marcus said, and his voice hard for the first time, and you want to contain 42 billion people. Because we have the audacity to be strong, and because we evolved to survive on a harsh world. And would you contain the Crickstar? Because they have natural armor. And would you contain the Velthani? Because they can move faster than most species. Can track. That is different. The counselor protested, and they do not hide their nature. Neither did we. Marcus shot back, and we chose to present ourselves in a way that would be accepted, and we chose to be diplomats and scientists and traders, instead of conquerors, and you are punishing us for that choice. Sareth stood again, and her voice cutting through the rising tension, and perhaps, she said, and we should focus on what Ambassador Chen did rather than what he could have done, and he was attacked by 5 trained fighters, and he could have killed them all in seconds, and instead he restrained them, and he stopped when the threat ended, and he chose not to escalate. She looked around the chamber, and that is not the action of a dangerous species. She said, and that is the action of a disciplined one. And perhaps we should be asking why our own members felt entitled to assault a council ambassador in the first place. The 5 attackers were present and standing in a detention area at the site of the chamber, and their trial had been swift and the evidence overwhelming. And now they awaited sentencing, and the Crickstar who had led the assault kept his eyes down and his mandibles still. 3 months had passed since the incident, and the galaxy had changed in ways both subtle and profound, and news of humanity's true nature had spread through every council world, and every trade station and every colony, and the reactions had been varied and complex and ongoing. Marcus stood in the memorial garden that had been created on the council station, and a place of reflection and peace, and the garden held plants from 100 worlds, and each one chosen for its symbolic significance. And at the center stood a new monument, and a crystalline structure that caught light and threw it in patterns that shifted with the time of day. The inscription was simple and written in Galactic Standard, and it read, "Strength tempered by choice." And underneath, in smaller text, dedicated to the principle that true power lies not in capability, but in restraint. Marcus had not asked for a memorial, but the council had insisted, and Sareth had led the effort in bringing together species that had never cooperated before, and all united in acknowledging what humanity had chosen and what that choice meant for galactic civilization. Ambassador Chen. A voice said behind him. Marcus turned to see a young Velthani female, and her skin showing the pale blue of youth, and her eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. And, "Yes?" he said gently. "My mother told me about you," the child said, and she said you are very strong, but you choose to be gentle. And is that true? Marcus smiled and knelt down to be at her eye level. "It is true," he said, "and all humans are strong, but we believe that being gentle is harder and more important than being strong." The child tilted her head, and, "Why is it harder? Because it takes effort," Marcus said, "and being strong is easy when you are born that way, and being gentle when you have the power to be otherwise, and that requires choosing to be gentle every single day, and that is the hard part." The child nodded slowly, and, "I want to be like that," she said. "I want to be strong and gentle." Marcus's smile widened. "And then you will be," he said, "and the galaxy will be better for it." The child's mother appeared, and apologetic and collecting her daughter, but she looked at Marcus with something that was not quite fear and not quite respect, and something in between, and "Thank you, Ambassador," she said, "and for showing us a better way." After they left, Marcus stood again and looking at the memorial and thinking about all the conversations, like that one and all the small moments where understanding replaced fear and where knowledge replaced prejudice. Quite a view. Another voice said Marcus did not turn in recognizing the speaker, and "Hello, Director Zhang," he said, "and I was not expecting you." Director Elena Zhang of Earth's Diplomatic Corps walked up beside him, and her own carefully maintained human form showing no signs of the strength she carried within. "And I came to check on you," she said, and to discuss your future." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "And my future," he repeated. "The incident has taken its toll," Zhang said, and her voice gentle but firm, "and your performance reviews show increased difficulty maintaining suppression, and your medical scans show elevated stress hormones, and your psychological evaluations indicate that you are struggling more than you admit." Marcus could not deny any of it, and the transformation had left scars that were not visible, but were no less real. "And I am managing," he said. "You are suffering," Zhang corrected, "and then that is nothing to be ashamed of. And what happened to you was traumatic, and the fact that you maintained your principles, and that you showed mercy, and that you helped create this," she gestured at the memorial, "and all of that is admirable, but it does not mean you have to keep doing this job." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and, "What are you saying?" "I am saying you have earned the right to go home," Zhang said, "and you have served Earth with distinction for 15 years, and you have accomplished more in the last 3 months than most diplomats accomplish in a lifetime. And if you want to return to Earth, and to rest, and to heal, and know, one would think less of you." The offer was tempting, and Marcus could imagine it, and could imagine Earth's normal gravity and familiar air and people who understood without explanation what it meant to be human. But he also thought about the young Velthani child, and about all the others who were learning and who were changing their understanding. "I am not finished here," Marcus said finally, "and there is still work to do." Zhang nodded as if she had expected that answer. "And then we will support you," she said, but we are also assigning you an assistant and someone who can share the burden and someone who can help maintain the facade when it becomes too difficult." She gestured, and a young human man approached, and his posture showing the careful control of diplomatic training. "And this is Junior Ambassador David Park," Zhang said, "and he graduated top of his class, and he specifically requested to work with you." David bowed slightly, and "It is an honor, Ambassador Chun," he said, "and I have studied your work and your approach to diplomacy, and I hope to learn from you." Marcus looked at the young man and saw the idealism and the hope and the belief that they could make a difference, and he remembered being that young and having that same belief, and he wondered if he still had it or if the assault had taken it from him. "Welcome, David," Marcus said, and extending his hand, "and I hope I can teach you something useful." Over the following weeks, Marcus and David worked together, and the younger man bringing energy and enthusiasm that Marcus had not realized he was missing, and they met with council members and negotiated trade agreements and addressed concerns about human expansion, and slowly and steadily, and the galaxy's perception of humanity continued to shift. Change was not universal, and there were still species that feared humanity and that argued for restrictions and for monitoring. But there were also species that saw opportunity, and that recognized that humanity's restraint made them ideal partners, and that their strength made them valuable allies. The Krigstar military had been particularly interested in sending observers to study human combat training, and not to copy it, but to understand it. And Redek himself had approached Marcus with a request that surprised everyone. "I wish to understand your training," the Krigstar counselor said during a private meeting, "and I wish to learn how you teach your people to suppress their nature, and the Krigstar have our own struggles with aggression, and perhaps we could learn from your methods." It was an acknowledgement That would have been impossible before the incident, and an admission that even the proud warrior species had something to learn from humanity, and Marcus had agreed, and arrangements were being made for cultural exchange programs and for shared training facilities. The 5 who had attacked Marcus had completed their rehabilitation and were now traveling to various worlds and speaking about their experience and teaching others about the dangers of prejudice, and Marcus had met with them once in a private meeting where they had apologized again, and where he had told them he forgave them and truly meant it. Lead Krigstar, and whose name Marcus had learned was Thekner, and had asked a question that stayed with Marcus, and, "Do you regret what happened?" Thekner had asked, and, "Do you wish we had never attacked you so that you could have maintained your secret?" Marcus had thought about it carefully before answering, and, "I regret the pain," he had said, "and I regret the difficulty it has created. But I do not regret that the truth came out, and hiding who we are was becoming harder and more costly, and perhaps it was time for honesty." Now, 3 months later, and Marcus stood again in the memorial garden, and this time with David beside him. "And do you think it will last?" David asked, "and the understanding and the acceptance, and will it continue, or will they forget?" Marcus considered the question, and watching as other beings visited the memorial, and some touching the crystal, and some simply standing in contemplation, and, "I think understanding is like suppression," he said finally, "and it requires constant effort and constant choice, and we will need to keep working at it and keep choosing to build bridges instead of walls, but yes, and I think it can last." A group of young aliens approached, and students on a field trip, and their teacher explaining the significance of the memorial, and Marcus listened as the teacher spoke about humanity's choice and about the decision to be gentle despite the capacity for violence. "And that is why," the teacher said, "and we must all strive to be like the humans and to choose what we want to be rather than accepting what we are born, as in to use our strength in service of peace rather than conflict," David whispered to Marcus, "and they are using us as an example and as a model for others." Marcus nodded, and feeling a mix of pride and concern, "And that is a heavy burden," he said, "and we will need to make sure we live up to it." As the students left, Marcus received a message on his communicator, and new ambassadors were arriving, and humans who had trained for years and who would now work openly and without needing to hide their nature as completely as Marcus's generation had. The new arrivals wore subtle badges and small pins that indicated their true nature, and a compromise that allowed them to present as diplomatic while being honest about their